All right, we are going to start right now. So my name is Chasen Robbins. I am the president of InterVarsity at Utah State InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. There's people in the audience wearing shirts who want to go say hi after. And one of the first things I want to say is that I am just extremely thankful for our relationship with the Secular Student Alliance. I mean, Brock and Chase, so this is Chase, I'm Chasen, big difference. And Tony have just been a huge blessing for Utah State and for InterVarsity too. And be sure, Chase is going to talk a little bit more about this. When you go back and you look at the tables, there's so many good tables. And if you could only choose one, really, if you could only choose one table, you should go to InterVarsity. Okay, now Chase is going to talk about, one more thing. We are going to text in questions. So nobody's coming up to the mic to ask Bryan or Dan questions. You're going to text in questions. You can vote for the best ones on the app, and then Chase and I will select what questions we think are best for the speakers.
Thank you, Jason. I also want to say that it has been awesome working with InterVarsity. They're a really well-organized group. They've helped out a lot with this. We want to thank all of you for coming out tonight and showing your support. It's really nice to be able to have these types of events on campus. We also make it a point to try to always have these events be free for everybody because a lot of students simply can't afford it. So you'll notice there was no admission charge tonight. However, if you would like to support these types of events in the future, we have donation boxes out. They're going to be up at the tables. Feel free to donate afterwards if you'd like to support these types of events on campus in the future. So we're going to introduce our moderator, which is Tom here. Tom, if you'd like to stand up. Sure.
Yeah, Tom is the regional director of Rochester Christie and will be moderating our debate. So here you are, Tom.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you guys, Chase and Chasen. Now, does that mean Chasen's chasing Chase, or I don't know, but anyway. You guys put it on. It takes a lot of energy to put an event like this on. So let's give these guys a big hand for all the work they're doing. Well, Chasen and I go back a ways. He was actually grew up in the church that I was a pastor at. So now here he is, graduating with his degree in philosophy in his senior year. And my boss, who has a PhD in philosophy, told me this one. He said, you know what the difference between pizza and a philosophy major is? The pizza feeds you. So. Sorry for any philosophy majors out there. Well, welcome. This is a great campus, great buildings, Utah State, great setting. Man, this is a great place to be, great place to have a debate. And now I wanted to start by saying I just finished a graduate level class at the University of Utah in conflict resolution. So I am qualified to be an official mediator. So what that means is conflict resolution. So Dan, Bryan, you're not going to be able to leave tonight until you guys both come in full agreement, all right? Might be a long night tonight. Thanks everybody for coming, and there's two subjects that we're all not supposed to talk about, right? Politics and religion, and we're going to be talking about that tonight. But tonight, the subject for the debate is God or naturalism the best explanation for the existence of mosquitoes? Are you ready for that one, guys? No, just kidding. All right. The topic for the discussion or debate is the ancient and modern question of, does God exist? There's probably no other subject that will cause more emotional conflict than this subject. Now, whatever preconceived notions we brought with us tonight, I hope that we can all have a genuine, sincere seeking of truth. That's what we're all about here tonight, everybody, okay? Now, we can't all accept the world as everybody else accepts it. We couldn't do that because there's so many different ways we look at the world. But what we can all do is try to understand why people see it the way they do. And so I think we can all agree that an idea is strong, not because of how loud we present it or how arrogantly we present it, but because of what makes it strong is the logic and the evidence of the content, okay? Emotions are real, but they're not always reality. And so what we want to do tonight is be guided by reasoned analysis. Today we're constantly bombarded by, illogical points of view from every aspect. So we want to look at things, just look at them. What we'd like to pursue tonight is a lofty and ambitious goal of an example of being able to rigorously discuss a subject from every point of view and doing it in a way that is honorable, which is what education should be, right? Looking at everything and let the dross fall to the bottom and the pure gold rise to the top. Now, knowing these two gentlemen, and notice I said gentlemen, they're going to be able to talk about this subject in a way that differing point of view. It'll be rigorous but cordial tonight. No fist fighting or anything like that. You guys were talking. You're doing good. All right. Now that goes for the audience as well. All right. Tonight, given the nature of tonight, we ask that you do it in accordance with Utah State class policy. Now, I have no idea what that policy says, but I'm sure it says something like no tomato throwing or yelling or something like that. We need to be cordial about this. And what we do ask, and really during the debate, please no clapping, no booing or anything like that. We'll save that till the end. You can roll your eyes if you do it quietly, all right? So, the format tonight will be this. 15-minute opening statements, 10-minute responses, 5-minute rebuttals, and then we're going to have 15 minutes of questions from the audience, and those are the directions up there. And then each speaker will have 45 seconds to answer with a 15-minute response to that from the other one. Second, yes. And so that's the way that's going to work. All right. Now, this event is being streamed as well. Now, as the debates go, the one arguing the affirmative, Bryan will go first. And the one arguing the negative, Dan, consequently, will go second, and we'll have the final word in tonight's debate. All right. And in this corner, arguing the affirmative is Bryan Hurlbutt, and he's also a friend of Ratio Christi. And if you're wondering what Ratio Christi is, it's kind of like InterVarsity, another campus ministry. It's Latin for the reason for Christ. We emphasize apologetics, giving historical, philosophical, and scientific reasons for the Judeo-Christian worldview. So Bryan, friend of RC and also lead pastor of Lifeline community in West Jordan, Utah. Bryan received his bachelor's degree in religious education from Davis College and his master's degree in theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, and his doctorate of ministry from Talbot School of Theology focused on how worldview, philosophy, and culture relate to the local church. He is the author of Tasty Jesus, Liberating Christ from the Power of Our Predilections, and a contributor to Sharing the Good News. He's also the voice of today's Lifeline, the radio ministry heard throughout northern Utah. He's married with 3 daughters. And in our other corner here, we have Dan, and he's arguing the negative. Dan Barker is I just found out he's living in Wisconsin, so we have that in common. I'm from Wisconsin. And we have something else in common. He's a former evangelical minister. I'm not a minister anymore. And he's co-president of Freedom from Religion Foundation. He is the author of a number of books, including Godless, How an Evangelical Preacher Became One of America's Leading Atheists. Dan has appeared on dozens of TV shows, including Oprah Winfrey, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and he's the host of Free Thought Radio. And he has done more than 120 public debates. Dan is also an accomplished musician and songwriter. All right. Are you going to do some of that tonight?
Where's the piano?
All right. Okay. Well, without any further ado, you guys can come on up. And Bryan will start tonight.
begin. It's great to be with you. It's wonderful to meet Dan. It's great to see the campus, both ministries and organizations, and thanks for having this debate. It's an important one. Does God exist? The answer is yes. Let's close in prayer. Now, we've got to talk more than that. When you begin a debate like this, one of the crucial questions is who bears the burden of proof, and typically those who go in the affirmative position are the ones that bear the burden of proof. I would kind of like to draw your attention up here just to begin thinking about that a little bit. I am a theist, which means that I affirm that God exists. An atheist, small a, takes a position that doesn't affirm that God exists, so lacks a belief in that sense, and it's often referred to as a negative atheism. But then there's another type of atheism. There's a capital A atheism, or an anti-theist, who would affirm that God does not exist. And it seems clear to me that the moment you step into articulating a positive proposition, that you have something to prove. I think we all would agree with that. I put a question mark by the small letter atheist because I still think there's a burden of proof, because really what Dan and I are talking about is we're giving two different accountings for what reality consists of. And we're really giving two meta-narratives for how we talk about reality. So at the end of the day, once we approach ultimate reality and begin to discuss it, we have to evaluate those competing meta-narratives. Now, Dan, in his book, Godless, really kind of makes this point. He says, in the Western world, God is the Judeo-Christian deity, and God, small g, is any of the others. Give me a definition of a God, small g, and I'll tell you whether I am a theist, an atheist with a small a, or an atheist with a capital anti-theist. I am definitely anti-Yahwehist. And so what I would say is Dan has a burden of proof in that if he begins to talk about the biblical God or attempts to destroy a vision of the biblical God, then he's trafficked into positive atheism and has something to prove. I want to say something about the boundaries of the debate. It's very important because oftentimes in debates like this, we get off talking about creation and evolution and so forth like that. I think it's misguided. I agree with a companion in the faith, Richard Dawkins, who said the big war is not between evolution and creationism, but between naturalism and supernaturalism. And I couldn't agree more, and that's why we're going to talk about two stories: atheistic naturalism over against theistic supernaturalism. And as we do that in a short amount of time, I want to just define naturalism for you. There's sort of a cottage industry in all the different definitions of naturalism. So I'd like to take sort of a generic definition. It comes from the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy. And I've abridged it a bit, but these are the actual words minus a few things that I think don't pertain to tonight. It's a twofold view that everything is composed of natural entities, those studied in the sciences whose properties determine all the properties of things, persons included. Please take note of that. And acceptable methods of justification and explanation are continuous in some sense with those in science. This is basically saying that naturalism is a holistic meta-narrative that purports to account for all of reality, everything from the chair you're sitting in to you who are sitting in it. And it's not just about a metaphysical construct or a metaphysical explanation, it's a methodological one. It actually, naturalism gives a type of explanation. All explanations must in some way concur with those in science, one way or another. So a way of thinking about naturalism might be in related terms. You think about the epistemic context of naturalism, or the epistemic story of naturalism is scientism. The metaphysical story, if we want to say that, is materialism. And so when it comes to naturalism, it's making a holistic claim. Well, if it's making a holistic claim, then the following deductive syllogism in the form of modus tollens seems to hold. Premise 1. If naturalism is true, then it can account for all of reality. That's its claim. By its definition, it can account for all of reality. Premise 2. Naturalism cannot account for all of reality. Therefore, naturalism is not true. Now, of course, if you're paying attention, particularly if you're a naturalist, you're going to take umbrage with premise 2. You're going to immediately say, I'm not sure that premise 2 is right. Well, part of what I want to do is show you that I think premise 2, in fact, is right. And really, all we have to do is show that it can't account for one thing. I think we can show that it can't account for a host of things. And let's understand that when we talk about the existence of God, when we step into the naturalist story, naturalism is the meta-narrative of atheism. There's just no way around it. I've read 4 of Dan's books. It's clear that Dan is a naturalist of one ilk or another. And it very much is the meta-narrative that drives in that sense. And so one of the things we have to think about is naturalism self-consistent? I think naturalism as a worldview is like the George Costanza of worldviews. And I feel like naturalism sort of spends his time living in his Judeo-Christian parents' house, sort of bilking off of them. All of the checks are cashed by the Judeo-Christian worldview. The very fact that he can have a life comes out of the Judeo-Christian worldview and its roots. And a high number of its claims are rooted in many ways out of the background beliefs of Judeo-Christian worldview. And much like George Costanza living off his parents, I think at some point we got to kind of kick it out of the house and call it what it is. And so I'd like to do that. And to do that, we come back to these 2 meta-narratives, and I'd like to give you a sampling of what atheistic naturalism cannot account for. So let's think about this together. And we'll start with the first being human consciousness. It can't account for human consciousness. When I think about human consciousness and process it, I immediately recognize that I am immediately aware of myself. There's a me that's aware of myself, and that seems at odds with the idea that I am the sum total or equivalent to my brain states. But naturalism would teach that I'm in fact the equivalent of my brain states. So I'd like to give a few points along this line. First, there is a me who subsists all of the atomic and subatomic changes that happen in my body in general and in my brain in particular. Probably one of the most prominent neuroscientists in the world. In fact, in a publication about a decade ago, he was named as one of the 100 individuals most likely to change the next century. His name is Mario Beauregard, he's a French-Canadian. And in one of his books, he says the following statement: the average neuron, consisting of about 100,000 molecules, is about 80% water. The brain is home to about 100 billion such cells, and thus about 10 to the 15th power molecules. Each neuron gets 10,000 or so connections from other cells in the brain. Here's the important part. Within each neuron, the molecules are replaced approximately 10,000 times in an average lifespan. Yet humans have a continuous sense of self that is stable over time. So how on earth would I have a stable sense of self if I am equivalent to my brain states that consists of neurons and neural pathways and neural connections, and the neurons themselves, the molecular structures within them, are swapping themselves out 10,000 times in my lifetime? And by the way, for some naturalists who hold a view of emergentism, this seems to, I think, cut at emergentism, because if brain states sit at the bottom and in some way there's this epiphenomenal shadow, as some philosophers will call it, that emerges from my brain states, if my brain states are in fact changing and shifting and the molecular structures are swapping in and out 10,000 times in my lifetime, it seems odd that I would have a consistent sense of self that would project from those changing brain states. Number 2, it ends up having groundless thoughts. Naturalism, a regress of brain states, accounting for other brain states, interlocking with a past natural story of necessary but random events, leaves us with no reliable or trustworthy grounding or direction for those brain states. It's simply this: why would I trust what a randomly developed organ would tell me? Why would I at all think that it's in any way reliable whatsoever? Third, our thoughts are not accessible by third-person observation, which is a basic tenet of the naturalist story. For naturalism to be true, then it's observable, meaning that if naturalism is true, I could somehow be able to take off the top of my scalp, or better yet, through some type of functional magnetic resonance imaging, you could look in my brain and you could see that when I look at my life, a certain firing takes place. But how would you know what it is? You would only know what it is if you asked me what it is. There's no public access. You can see it, but you don't know what it is textured with. You don't know what sits under it. That's only available by first-person testimony. Naturalism, because it is completely immaterial, understanding, completely a material metaphysic, completely a material methodological and aesthetic understanding, that leads us to a place where you would only be able to comprehend it by third person, or be able to see it accessible by third person observation, always at all times. But that's not the case. There are physically unexplainable functions and characteristics that lead us to understand the potential for consciousness. I look out at you, a couple examples. I look out at you, and as I look in my visual field, I see different shapes. I see shapes of chairs, I see shapes of people with hair, I see the shape of the doorway, the clock, and so forth. And I catch them all in one visual field. But what happens as I capture them in my visual field is as they come in through my eye, I have retina signals that send them back into my brain and they terminate. But the shape of the clock, the color of your hair, the shape of the chair, the bar in front of me, they all individually come as individuated signals and terminate in different places in my brain without any physically, spatially extended unifier that brings them together. In other words, imagine that you plug things into the wall and there's no panel for you to plug them into. You're just plugging them into things that themselves are disconnected. How would they find unification? I would submit they find unification through a mental structure, a mind, not through a physical structure, a brain. Additionally, if I look and see the color of blue and green, for example, or I look at some of you, I have some friends here, I see familiar faces, I look at somebody else who's not familiar to me, that brain state, if we had functional resonance imaging, magnetic resonance imaging, would look the same. What differentiates it? How do we know it's different? There's a first person that is texturizing it that doesn't make it third person accessible. And fifth, simply there's a me who can act on my brain states. There's a me that happens to my brain states. I can, through mindfulness, when we learn this, I can actually happen in my brain states. I want to keep going because we have a second thing. Free will. There are two rails that free will operates on. First, it operates on one rail known as determinism. Things necessarily and causally happen in terms of efficient causes, if we were to speak in Aristotelian terms. And then it runs on another rail of reductionism, that is, that all things reduce simply to brain states. As I see it, naturalism's determinism eliminates freedom, and naturalism's reductionism eliminates the will. Look at the following two quotes from Dan Barker. Whatever we call it, if we throw out free will, we have to throw out moral judgment. Neither of them really exists. They only happen in the mind. Again, he says, the illusion of free will is useful. Without it, moral responsibility becomes meaningless. And I want you to file that away. Free will is an illusion. I've read his book on free will, and he has some odd things he says about how it actually is a sensation that wraps back around your brain states, and there's nothing clinical that would point to that being the case, outside of a philosophical presupposition that he has. The issue is this. If free will is out, he recognizes moral judgment is out. So let's talk briefly about objective morality very quickly. How does an atheist account for the existence of objective moral values, Dan writes? We atheists find our basis for morality in nature. That means that an atheist finds their basis for morality in the random, blind, purposeless, directionless process of successive brain states with no direction. Matter and energy, which make up everything according to naturalism, just are. They have no ought, so they have no morality to offer. You can't get something from just the way natural processes function. For naturalism to succeed, our oughts would be guided by what is. Therefore, the naturalist game of the survival of the fittest is actually the only game in town. Survival is naturalism's moral compass. Now keep in mind and pay attention, if Dan defines morality, which he usually does, as minimizing harm, we should also note that naturalism kills altruism. You can't have altruism with naturalism. And evolutionary naturalists will attempt to say something like, monkeys have reciprocal altruism. That's an oxymoron. I understand it's a term that's used in naturalism, but it's an oxymoron. I have altruism that then comes back to me is by definition not altruism. Naturalism can't account for a universal, binding, moral law. It can't bring us to a place where something is universal and binding and naturalistic attempts at morality devolve to either subjective social constructs of cultures or subcultures or utilitarian math equations. Hopefully we'll talk about that more. Neither yields any rooting for universal human rights. And then just for your looking pleasure, here are other examples that we don't have time to get into. But the point being, I think naturalism fails, and fails quite miserably.
Thank you very much, Bryan. And opening statement.
So thank you, Rashford Christie, thank you, InterVarsity, thank you, secular students, for putting on this debate, and thank you, Bryan, very articulate, very good speaker. During my rebuttal, I will respond to the points that you raised. You know, I used to preach that God exists. I preached for 19 years. You can read my story in the book Godless. But after a lot of reading and a lot of thinking, I eventually threw out all the bathwater and I discovered there's no baby there. If there's anything that's obvious, just look around and just think for a minute. If there's anything that's obvious, it's that the existence of God is not obvious. If God exists, why are we having a debate about it? Why do we need arguments? Why do we need reasons? Why do we need proofs? Why doesn't this God just simply reveal himself or herself to all of us? Is he too weak to do that? To speak for himself? This all-powerful God needs Bryan to make arguments for him. Think about that. Would you do that with anything else? This very debate tonight is Exhibit 1 against the existence of God. Can you bring the water bottle by any chance? Yes. Nobody knows. Thank you. What does the Bible say? If you give a glass of water in my name, you've done it unto the least of one of these. Nobody knows if a God exists. Bryan doesn't know if a God exists. Bryan has a belief. He doesn't have knowledge. Theism is the belief in a God. And even the Bible says, he who comes to God must believe that he exists. Belief, whatever it is not knowledge. Atheism, as Bryan correctly points out, at least the lowercase a, atheism, is a lack of that belief. Atheism simply means not theism. Theism is a belief. If the religions of the world were a list of TV channels, see, there's Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism. There's Confucianism, Islam, different forms of Christianity, Judaism, native belief systems, and so on. Thousands of religions in the world. Atheism would not be on that list. Where's atheism? Atheism is the off button. Atheism is none of the above. Atheists turn off the TV and they don't look through the screen. We look at the real world. We just see the natural world for what it is. The world that even Bryan admits exists. We both agree that there's a natural world. There's an old joke that if atheism is a religion, then baldness is a hair color. Or, as Bill Maher put it, abstinence is a sex position. So it follows that I don't have the burden of proof tonight. In any debate or any trial, the one who makes the charge has the burden of proof. Bryan is the prosecutor. He's charging our universe with breaking the laws of nature. I am the defense attorney with the principle of innocent until proven guilty. I don't have to prove anything. All I have to show is reasonable doubt. I'm an atheist because of these lacks. First, there's a lack of even a coherent definition of a God. Most believers, for example, say God is a spirit, but the word spirit has never been defined in positive terms. If you can't define it, you may as well say God is a flopper wobble. You know, what does it actually mean? Many definitions of God contain mutually exclusive characteristics, such as omniscience versus omnipotence, or omnipotence versus omnibenevolence, or free will versus omniscience. There's only time to mention one of those, and I'm glad Bryan brought it up. In my book, Free Will Explained, I discussed the free will argument for the non-existence of God. It's called FANG, F-A-N-G. Free will, whatever you think it is, requires uncertainty. If you know the future, you cannot have free will. You can't make any decisions because the future to you, if you know it, is fixed. Therefore, if God is defined as a personal being with free will and he knows the future, then he cannot exist. Arguing for a God with incompatible properties like this is like arguing for a married bachelor. If you can't define it coherently, how can it exist? Then there's a lack of good evidence for a God. The question of the existence of God is indeed a scientific question. A universe with a God in it would look different from a universe without a God. It's not just a metaphysical or philosophical question. If there were good evidence for a God, think about this. By now, someone should have won the Nobel Prize for pointing out the existence of a hitherto unknown force in the cosmos. Any scientist would jump at that. Let's do it. Let's prove it. There ought to be some way to show that perhaps prayer actually does work better than random chance. Or perhaps miracles do happen. Let's go for it. That's never been done. The Bible, as we see, is not good evidence, as we will see. And of course, miracle reports are just stories. There's also a lack of a good argument. Birch and Russell said that most of these theological arguments simply boil down to bad grammar. The design argument, by the way, I think mosquitoes are evidence against design. You're from Wisconsin, right?
Yeah.
So we know about mosquitoes. What good are they? Who designed that thing? The cosmological argument, the ontological, the moral argument, and so on, they're really just bad logic. When you scratch beneath the surface, they beg the question, or they engage in category error, or they equivocate. When the ancients would hear the thunder and they saw the lightning in the sky, the only way they could explain it was by invoking agency, such as Thor or Zeus. But now that we know something about electricity and the weather, we don't need those gods to fill those gaps. When those gaps closed, those gods died. There's a lot of gaps. Bryan raised some gaps. The gaps are what drives science. But to throw up our hands and simply say, God did it, well, that's just laziness. Then there's the lack of agreement among believers about the nature and the moral principles of this God. Paul said in the Bible, let there be no divisions among you. Yet the religions of the world, especially Christianity, are hopelessly fractured into divisive camps. Believers have killed each other over trivial doctrinal differences. Paul also said God is not the author of confusion. But can you think of a single book that's caused more confusion than the Bible? You believers should first get your act together before you talk to us non-believers. You're all fragmented and fighting with each other. How do we know which version of your God that we're supposed to even deal with? Name any moral issue that society is struggling with right now. What? The war, or abortion, or women's rights, or gay rights, or you name it. A long list of issues. You will find good, Bible-believing, church-going Christians on both sides of those issues. The Bible is worthless as a moral guide. Then there's the lack of a good reply to the problem of evil. There have been a lot of theodicies put forth, but there is no good one. All you have to do is walk into any children's hospital, and you know there's no good God. Maybe there's an evil God, but there's no good God. Those believing parents are praying desperately, and their children die at the same rate as random, uncaring chance. Then there's no need for a God. Hundreds of millions of good people lead loving, joyful, meaningful, moral, charitable, purposeful, and hopeful lives without believing in the supernatural world. My book, Mere Morality, explains how we don't need a God to be good. But what are we really talking about here? Bryan touched on it. If it weren't for the Bible, Bryan would not be up here tonight. The Bible is what drives him. That's his source of truth. But the Bible, if you look at it, is an unreliable guide to truth. It's also unreliable in its moral claims. Most Christians are good, but the God they worship is not. The Bible has a lot of unbelievable stories, talking snakes and wizards and sorcerers and demons and the Nile River turning to blood and the sun standing still, millions of animal species floating in one big box. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but I actually think people should read the Bible. Reading the Bible can help destroy your faith. Actually read it. A. Milne said the Old Testament is responsible for more atheism than any book ever written. Isaac Asimov agreed. Properly read, the Bible is the most potent force for atheism ever conceived. If you actually read it, you'll see that the Bible is contradictory, unhistorical, unscientific, and morally corrupt. The Bible says God is good, but the Bible shows that he is not. If a good tree can't bring forth evil fruit, it follows that a good God who is evil not only does not exist, but, like a married bachelor, cannot exist. The alpha male deity in the Bible reflects the fears, ignorance, territorialism, and violence of the ancient patriarchal Israelites. Richard Dawkins got it right. He said, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Richard asked me to document each of those nasty adjectives, and it became a book, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction, with more than 1,500 passages describing those exact characteristics by God's own words and his own actions. Here's just a few examples. God is an ethnic cleanser. You shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land, for I have given you the land to possess. Utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant. That's God talking. God is genocidal. You must not let anything that breathes remain alive. You shall annihilate them. So they utterly destroyed the men, the women, the little ones of every city, and left none to remain. There are dozens of passages of genocide, commanded, condoned, and committed by the bloodthirsty biblical God. God is unjust. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents. That's just wrong. We all know that is wrong. That's morally wrong. God is capriciously malevolent. There's Job with his friends. Here's what I think is the most damning verse in the entire Bible, Job 2:3. The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? You incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. God confessed that he tortured a good man and killed his innocent children for no reason. Those are his words. And yet Bryan worships this malevolent God, this genocidal being. God is aborticidal. Because she has rebelled against her God, their little ones shall be dashed in pieces, and their pregnant women ripped open. That's the Bible. That's God himself using abortion as a punishment. What crime did the fetus commit to make God so angry? May the Lord cause you to become a curse among your people when he makes your womb miscarry. God is neither pro-choice nor pro-life. According to the Bible, he is anti-life. What about Jesus? Wasn't he nicer than his Father? Well, Jesus said, I and the Father are one. The Father is in me, and I am in the Father. I think the New Testament is a huge missed opportunity. Jesus could have said, I apologize for my dad. He was a big sexist jerk. Instead, Jesus said, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. If this biblical cartoon villain really did exist, he would not be worthy of my admiration, much less my worship. And yet Bryan thinks this is the source of moral values. Those passages I read are a tiny sample. You don't have to buy my book. You can find all of them for free online at unpleasantgod.ffrf.org. unpleasantgod.ffrf.org. I don't have time to mention the contradictions or the historical, scientific mistakes in the Bible, but I think we've seen enough to ask this question, which is at the heart of tonight's debate. What do you think is more likely? That the Bible is the product of an immaterial, supernatural being, or the Bible is the product of patriarchal priests and fearful prophets? Since there is no coherent definition, no good evidence, no good argument, no agreement among believers, no good reply to the problem of evil, no need for a God, And since the biblical God is evil by his own words and actions, and therefore not a source of moral values, I think there is more than enough reasonable doubt to return a verdict of not guilty. It makes perfect sense not to believe in the existence of God.
Okay, great. Obviously, Dan said a lot in that, and which makes it hard in that short amount of time. But you know what? I have a number of responses. I've watched Dan debate a handful of times, and he constantly comes back to this idea of defining a spirit. So Dan, I want to define a spirit for you, and I hope that in future debates you'll stop asking my questions. I'm going to define it. And positively, not negatively. The definition of spirit is a metaphysical entity that animates the physical and may possess personhood. The definition of spirit in the abstract would be metaphysical animation. So now, you may object because you have a materialistic worldview that I haven't defined it in materialistic terms, but that's an epistemic distinction between us, and that's why we're debating, because we actually understand reality differently along those lines. Also, you mentioned that knowledge, or that we don't have knowledge of these things, we just have belief. But I think if you're a beginning philosophy student, I would hope that you understand that knowledge is defined as justified true belief. It's not an inimical belief, it's a question about whether the beliefs are credible or not. We have all kinds of beliefs. We operate on beliefs. You operated on beliefs when you got on an airplane and came this way. And they were good beliefs because it was obviously got you here safely. He says the existence of God is a scientific question. I would fundamentally disagree with that because I would disagree with Dan's presupposition about what counts for science. So if you define the rules of the game already and you want to say that what counts for science is something that is only sense perceptible, well then you've got your answer. But you're just smuggling your worldview into the question is all you're doing. It's not a genuine question at all at that point. So Dan's right. I do assume and am happy to talk about the natural world. I think the natural world is wonderful. And but I think I have more within my intellectual options to choose from because I don't diminish that which is not physical. I think there are things that are clear. I think we have things like the uniformity of nature, I think we have things like mathematical laws. I think we have things like that are prescriptive. I don't think they're just descriptive of observables. I think they're actually prescriptive in that 2 + 2 = 4, not because I look and everybody else looks and everybody else looks. And it may not be the case tomorrow. I think we can bank on tomorrow that 2 + 2 will = 4 because it's actually a law that is prescriptively governing in that way. Dan talks about that we sort of throw out this idea that when we don't know how something happens, we just say God did it. Sort of the God of the gaps, we throw it up. Dan does the same thing, only I would say this. Dan commits what Karl Popper, if you remember Karl Popper called promissory materialism. He promissory naturalism. You just look at it and you go, science hasn't answered it yet, but it will. But it will. I would say both of those are really bad answers. I would say we have to be abductive at that point in our reasoning. And I think that's my attempt on the deductive syllogism was to show the second premise is buttressed by abductive or inferential reasoning to the best explanation. And I think that theism adequately accounts for things like human consciousness, a personal God, dispenses to me in his image all the facets of personhood, order, and all of the things that I see in human consciousness. A personal God dispenses to me a moral awareness. A great question in your objection regarding God is, I'm very perplexed on naturalistic lights how you get the moral warrant, actually, to interview God in such a way. And since God is actually a fictitious being, according to your perspective, it seems like you're just mad at ancient culture. Because it's just apparently the projections of ancient Jews and ancient Israelites. Dan mentioned Job 2:3 as the worst verse in the Bible. I want to read it again. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth. A blameless and upright man fears God and turns away from evil. He holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. I think Job must be the atheist's favorite book in the Bible. I was flying back years ago from a conference in Europe, and the guy next to me was an atheist, and he brought up something from a different text. We went into Job, talked a little bit about Job. It's perplexing to me why this is the worst verse in the Bible and why it bothers you so much. The statement, he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. Well, there's two ways of looking at that. Reasons can be efficient causes or final causes. And it's not as though he does this, he does it without an efficient cause. There's no reason in Job that Job has done something why God would do this. That doesn't mean that God doesn't have a reason for doing it. Someone who enters into Navy SEAL training enters in and they haven't done anything to deserve the grueling pain that they're going through, and that they're going through in some major emotional wear and tear, some major psychological wear and tear, some major physical wear and tear. But it certainly is for a reason. It's for a purpose, or it's for an end. It's to an end. And so at bottom, this issue doesn't seem to me to be a problem at all. The idea is that God comes in as a purposive creator, as a purposive sustainer, and as a purposive redeemer, moving things toward that redemptive end. Now, I've read Dan's book, God, Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction, that was sort of from that famous quote by Richard Dawkins. And what Dan does in that book, and he started to do it here a little bit, in debate form, you call it the Gish Gallop, right? We can change it to the Barker Barrage, because it sort of is this, like, I'm going to flood you with all these texts, or I'm going to flood you with these ideas, and so can you handle this text, this text, this text? Well, if we had time, we could talk about all those kinds of things. But hermeneutically speaking, I've read Dan's book, and each chapter begins with a little summary, starts, Dan's a good writer, he's an engaging writer, and as he engages it, he does so by chronicling one typical passage and then moves to give you just a list of text verses. Well, a text taken out of context is just a pretext for whatever you would like it to mean. And I can honestly say, as somebody that spent a lot of time in Greek and Hebrew, a lot of time in exegetical work over a number of years, not every text, but a lot of texts are egregiously pretextual, I can't see it, are egregiously pretextual and so forth. I think there's also theological problems, and of course you have different presuppositions, but Dan speaks of morality in his writings, and he has a chapter in his book of Free Will, in his book Morality, and he describes morality as that which minimizes harm. It's actually, and I've seen in debate, he says he's not a utilitarian. It's a form of act utilitarianism. It's a negative form of act utilitarianism. But Dan takes that position. It seems odd that he would take umbrage with an eternal sovereign God then, who could make up for any temporal negative experience he has to put anybody through, who could have eternity to make up for any temporal harm. I don't really understand by your own moral rights and your own moral definition why that's problematic given the nature of God in his orientation according to classic Christian theology. I'd also add that to say there's no good arguments for the existence of God, it sounds great. It's egregiously false. There may be no more robust intellectual tradition that's ever been written about in the Western world, walking us from Augustine through the medievals into Aquinas, into Duns Scotus, moving all the way forward into Hugo Grotius and others that walked us into even modern writers with a robust analytical tradition, with a robust classical tradition, with a remarkable Aristotelian logic and so forth. So I find that actually quite incredible and quite dubious to sort of arrive at that. And then one final comment in regard to the moral monster argument, the M&A argument, as I call it, in the Octagon. I think that It's a fundamental misunderstanding that if God is ultimate existence, and if he is greater than that which can be thought, as the classical philosophers define it, then what I would say is that idolatry then becomes the supreme evil, and idolatry then sits behind almost every response of judgment that God offers.
Thank you, Bryan. Well, if there were such great arguments, you should have brought them forth tonight. You should have put them on the table. It seems to me that most of what you are saying tonight is that we have a lot of questions. Consciousness. Human thoughts are not accessible to other people. Free will, what is that all about? Objective morality, a lot of questions that are being raised, which are good questions. But it seems like you're saying, well, therefore, since we have all these questions that we can't really answer, therefore, God exists. But did Bryan connect any dots? Did he define this being? He defined spirit with just a synonym for spirit. He didn't tell us what spirit is positive. A metaphysical essence? There's smuggling your conclusion into your argument, because the existence of metaphysical entities is one of the very things you're trying to prove with your arguments. If you're trying to prove supernaturalism or non-naturalism. So what is a spirit? How much does it weigh? How much space does it take up? How does it move? How does it tether to the brain? When I walk across the room, do I have a spirit that tethers to my mind in some way and is in my brain but not in yours? What actually is a spirit in positive terms? Usually it's defined in negative terms, the incorporeal, or intangible, or the ineffable, or the metaphysical, which is just another word for saying I don't know. You haven't really defined what a spirit is. And the Bible even says God is a spirit, which means your God is made out of something that's called spirit. God is a spirit, and they who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Consciousness is no biggie. I'm sure you're aware of the many, many well-researched and well-argued books about consciousness by Hofstadter, by Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett has a book called Consciousness Explained. In fact, we just interviewed Dan Dennett last Thursday for our TV show, where we talked about how his definition of consciousness really is the center of narrative gravity. Consciousness is not a thing. If you're treating consciousness as if it were a thing or an object, then of course you're going to look for some source of it, like it's some element, some particle or something. What is consciousness? It is true that consciousness is an emergent property of a functioning mind. And so the mind is functioning. Just because the neurons are changing over someone's life doesn't mean that consciousness goes away. That'd be like saying, since the automobiles are always changing on the highway, there's no such thing as traffic. Traffic is the collection of what's going on. Consciousness is not a thing. Consciousness is a label for a function. It'd be like saying, where is digestion? Where is it? Is digestion a big capital D thing? Digestion is a label for the functioning of an organ. What happens when the stomach dies? There's no more digestion. Did that digestion disappear? To reify a word like digestion, which is a function of an organ, is the same crime as reifying something like consciousness, which is the function of an organ. It's not a thing that you would locate, that you could buy somewhere in the supermarket. The heart is the thing. The heart has circulation. So what is circulation? It's no contradiction to say that circulation is not a thing, but circulation exists. Circulation is a label for the functioning of the organ. Consciousness is a label for the functioning of an organ, no matter what it's made out of. And you can't destroy consciousness with reductionism. And of course, we know consciousness changes all the time. And Anton Damasio's wonderful book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, explaining how a natural explanation for consciousness. So even if you disagree with it, you can't deny that there are natural explanations for the origin and the understanding of consciousness and of free will. So that kind of knocks out one of your pegs. Of course, I wrote a whole book about free will, and free will is not a thing either. And I'm a hard determinist, and I do think free will is an illusion, and I agree with Sam Harris that it's an illusion, but I think it's a useful illusion. I think there's a lot of illusions. For example, I don't have depth perception because my two eyes operate differently, so I'm seeing two of you.
But when I do put on the glasses and I see depth perception, that's a wonderful illusion. I'm seeing two things. You're seeing two of me right now, but your brain is focusing into making it into one. So that's a useful illusion. And there are many illusions in life that are powerful. Free will is one of those illusions. It doesn't exist as a thing, but it's a very useful way for us to not just navigate the three-dimensional world of sight, but the moral world of moral judgment. So I don't think there's such a thing as objective morality, but I do think morality can be objectively justified by reference to the natural world. And as long as we do have plausible, workable, naturalistic explanations for morality, and you can't deny that we do, it would be lazy, or it would be irresponsible to just jump to some kind of a supernatural. So yes, I think all of us, I think even you agree with me on this. A moral person is a person who acts with the intention of minimizing overall harm. That's what we mean by morality. If you had to reduce it to one word, morality would reduce to the word harm. What's the harm in this action? What is the harm in this chemical in the river? What is the harm in this happening here? What is the harm of my behavior to some other person or animal? So I can say that although objective moral values are not really things, because values are a function of our brain as well, I think we can justify our moral decisions by reference to the real world, the natural world, by looking at harm. Because what is harm? Harm, no matter what it is something physical. It's something material. It's something natural. And the avoidance of harm, whatever that harm is a natural material exercise. I think most Christians are good moral people because they ascribe to a principle of trying to minimize overall harm. And I think Bryan let the cat out of the bag when he suggested at the end of his remarks there that it all comes down to idolatry. Idolatry? If you look at the Bible, the biggest sin in the Bible, the biggest crime in the Bible, and Bryan is right, is idolatry. God's a jealous God. You should worship me and me only. Don't have any other gods besides me. He's like a possessive, angry, abusive husband who says to his wife, you love me, I love you. This is between you and me. If you ever look at another man, I'm going to pull your hair out, and I'm going to burn you, and I'm going to spread cow poop on your face. I'm not making this up. It's in the Bible. It's this possessive, dynamic love that you find in there, this God of the Bible who's so jealous. And so that's why Bryan would say idolatry is the big evil, because idolatry pulls away from the worship of his jealous, angry God. And he even calls the Israelites his wife, and he calls himself their husband. It's a very patriarchal, male-dominated, sexist view of religion that you find in the Bible. To their credit and to Bryan's credit, most of you Christians have risen above that brutality. You're better than your own Bible. You're better than your own God. So yes, we do have a good, solid, objective, natural basis for morality that doesn't treat morality or moral values like there are these things that are floating up there that need somehow some transcendent explanation. It's a label for a function, and values are a function of the brain. When the brain dies, the values die with it, right? And when the brain dies, the consciousness dies with it. We do know how consciousness changes as the body changes, as we get older, as drugs affect it, as lack of sleep and so on. I'm a little sleep deprived. We just got back from Poland, and what is that, 9 hours difference? So jet lag. By the way, Annie and Roy and I visited Auschwitz for the first time, which was really a sobering experience last Tuesday. And talk about morality. Those Nazis with firm conviction would go to meet rooms. They believed in God. They were doing what they thought was a godly work, and most of those perpetrators are unapologetic for what they did, believing that theirs was a righteous way. Of course, I don't think Hitler was an example of any kind of a good Christian. He was nuts. He was crazy. But it does show you that Bible believers, they were Lutherans and they were Catholics. It wasn't just Hitler. They were Lutherans and Catholics. They believed the Bible. They went to church and they committed these moral atrocities, which you find in the Bible. The Bible is genocide. The Bible is an ethnic cleansing. The God of the Bible was very anti-life. And no, I'm not taking those verses out of context. I know the Bible. In fact, in my book, I go to as much detail as I can in one book, right, to explain it and to explain the surrounding verses. And I invite you to look it up yourself. These examples of evil and terror that the God of the Bible that you love committed against people. And what crime was it of the children of Job? You know, Satan came with God's permission and killed Job's 10 children. Bryan says that's for some higher redemptive purpose. So when Satan was killing these 10 kids, did he say to them, by the way, I want you to know, this is not terrorism. This is all going to end up with this moral arc of the death of Jesus someday. So the book of Job has no moral value. And Bryan even repeated it. God said, for no reason. Whatever reason you want to come up with, you're disagreeing with God. He murdered and he killed and he tortured for no reason. So I don't have time to address the rest. Maybe we'll get back to it through questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. 5-minute rebuttal.
Okay. Again, plenty to respond to. First, I'll just mention the Job 2:3 thing. It's, words often get used, and in fact rarely get used, in multiple ways with one usage. So when he says for no good reason, he either means efficient cause or he means ultimate purpose. And so he does mean one versus the other in that text. He doesn't mean both in that regard. Your statement about having to find God, I'll do that for everybody, that's fine. I actually think a helpful one, a very abstract, admittedly but helpful one, is Karl Barth's in his definition that God is wholly other, wholly meaning W-H-O-L-L-Y. He's completely distinct from us. Whatever you are, he is not in that way. But I think another way of saying it is that he's the non-contingent ultimate reality possessing eternal perfections in personal Trinitarian community. That's a mouthful, but I think it's worth unpacking and worth thinking about if you want to think at all about theism and its implications, because that statement actually ends up forming the ground of moral awareness, the ground of existence itself, the ground of cosmological order. It forms the ground of communal relational properties in terms of Trinitarian community. It forms the ground of using even language that something is better than something else because it defines that there's an ultimate best in that way when it comes to moral act. I do actually, Dan, you said you didn't think I would deny this. I do deny that you can somehow by naturalistic rights create a justification for objective morality. I do not think you can create a justification for universal benevolence and human rights. And the reason is that there is one simple question that constantly plagues the naturalist in almost every single issue that emerges. And it's a fairly basic question. It's one we get all the time from our children, but it's a valid question, which is why? Why be moral at all? Why choose to do that? In fact, in a debate with Kyle Butt a number of years ago that I watched, which when you debate a guy named Kyle Butt, it made me feel better with the last name Hurlbutt. When you debated Kyle Butt, he had a great question he asked you, and I think it's insightful on this regard of minimizing harm. He pointed out that that in Dan's, what I would call his negative act utilitarianism, if aliens were to come to this planet and they were to say, Dan, we have the capacity to kill everyone on the planet unless you rape this woman, would you do it? Dan said, admittedly, Dan is a good man. He's not a moral monster. So Dan said, everything in me would not want to. I would probably kill myself afterwards. I remember you saying that because you're a good guy. He said, but yes, because it would save, at that time, 6 billion, now 7.4 billion people. So the next question was, well, what about 2 billion? The answer was, yeah, I guess I'd have to. Then the next question was, what about 2 million? See, my question is, by naturalistic lights, how high does the numerator have to get in terms of raping women before you have the justification to no longer rape someone in terms of naturalistic objective morality? Please understand, much like Dan said, Christian hypocrisy is rampant. That doesn't mean he's accusing me of hypocrisy. I'm not accusing Dan of immorality. I think Dan's probably a very moral, keeping, good guy from my interactions with him, my reading about him, and what he's attempted to accomplish in his life. I don't doubt that for a minute. That's different than arriving at a place of justification. Okay? That's very different than arriving at a place of justification. And I think we need to think about that. He accuses me of what's called reification. Reification is a fallacy that smuggles in Dan's worldview. He says, I'm taking a thing and I'm making a thing out of something that's not a thing. Well, that's because we have different views of what things are. And we don't have the same view of what things are. So I don't think I'm reifying at all. I think you're reifying. Because you say harm, and I'd love for you to weigh harm, touch harm, taste harm. You say it's natural. But it's not. Because if a surgeon takes a blade and cuts into my chest, and you take a blade and cut in my chest with aggression and intent, but he does it to heal, it's the same act, cutting the same molecules, dividing the same way. One is causing harm, one is causing healing. That's rooted in intention. That's not rooted in what's happening in the material properties of the cut. So as a result, you're reifying when you use the word harm, and you're genuinely reifying when you use the word harm, because reification is actually available to you as a logical fallacy because of your naturalistic perspective on space. One final thing, emergentism, I think, is false because, yes, if you take out the cars, there's still traffic, but there's different traffic. That's the point. Different traffic means that you couldn't have a continuous sense of self. That was my point. Thank you.
So my definition of morality is to act with the intention of minimizing overall harm. So I use that word intentionally, you use as well. So obviously, I think we would all agree that if you take a needle and you jab it into a baby, that's not a good thing to do. If the baby hurts, the baby cries, don't do that. Unless the baby needs a life-saving injection, then you will. So you've read my book, Your Morality, so you know that sometimes in order to go north on the moral compass to avoid harm, sometimes you have to go east and west a while. You might have to amputate a limb. That's harmful if you're saving a life. Or you might even have to go south a while because the terrain is difficult. As long as your intention is to head north, your intention is to end up with a world with an overall minimal harm. That's what morality means. And harm is not a reified thing. Harm is natural. It's disease, it's predation, it's lack of shelter, it's hunger, it's thirst, it's pain and suffering, it's you name it. You can make a long list of things that are harmful. They are natural things. And the avoidance of them is a natural avoidance. We build homes, we try to feed people, we try to do things naturally to avoid natural harm to other sentient beings. Why do we do that? It's like a big question. Why be moral? Why be good? Why care? Because we are a species. All species care about their survival. And we have evolved natural altruistic instincts, just like, as you point out, so have other animals evolved. We see other animals helping and sacrificing and giving and doing the same thing we primates do. So this whole question boils down to a natural question. It's not reifying the idea of harm. Harm is a definition of that which threatens the well-being and the survival of the individual. So the intention does matter. If you run through my property and trample my garden because you're fleeing from an attacker, I'm not going to press charges. Because in the overall picture, my garden is minimal harm for what's happening to you. But if you run and trample my garden because you hate atheists and you hate me, well then I'm going to press charges. The intention matters of what you're doing there. So harm can be measured physically. My answer to Kyle Butt about raping women, that was, there's probably no good way to talk about that, because sometimes you do have to cause harm to minimize harm, and so it brings up this science fiction example of aliens coming down. And yes, morality isn't just pure mathematics. Utilitarianism would be a mathematical computation about what's the least amount of harm for the most amount of people. And in that weird situation in which none of us ever live, if we had to make a horrible choice like that, I wouldn't do it. I couldn't do it. But if that was done, somebody could at least make a moral justification for why one person would suffer over another. I think rape is inherently evil and wrong no matter how, whatever reason you give for it. I would never have said, and I hope you weren't thinking I was saying, there are some times when rape would be something good to do. No, I would never say that. Universal benevolence and human rights, I think it all basically comes down to our natural instincts to survive. We are social animals. You and I evolved as social animals to relate to each other and to protect each other. And so, of course, in the cosmos, in the big picture, it doesn't matter. In the big picture, there is no purpose of life, and that's kind of good, actually. But in the immediate picture where we live our lives, there is purpose in life. So if we can minimize harm, we can treat each other with respect, we can treat each other with value within this context of the social species we live in, there you have a firmly rooted basis for morality. So why do we bother? Because we love our species. Why do we bother? I mean, it's kind of a duh question. Why do you want to keep living? Well, duh, because life is intrinsically valuable on its own for its own sake. I have 1 minute left. You're wrong. The question, I'm sorry, I mean, you might be right about a lot of things, I'm sure. But you're wrong about the question about being a scientific question. It is indeed a scientific question. Because if there's a God in the universe will look different in some way than if there were not. For example, the Bible promises that prayers will be answered. That would be scientifically measurable. We could look at the amount of prayers that are prayed and look at the results and compare them with randomness. And if we saw that prayers were answered at a higher rate than random chance, there would be a scientific experiment that would verify the truth of your Bible and the existence of your God. So far, when we do those experiments, it doesn't do any better than random chance. Therefore, I'm not saying this proves there's no God. I'm saying this pulls out a leg from the argument that there is a God, the whole idea of answers to prayer and miracles. This is indeed a scientific question. You can't duck it by using words like metaphysical or transcendent or spiritual.
All right. Okay, at this time, we will. Looks like we had a lot of questions come in, and so Chase and Chasen will be asking those questions, and we'll be doing 15 minutes of that, and you will each have 1 minute. The question will have 1 minute each, and if it's asked to Bryan, you have 45 seconds, and then you have 15 then to give a rebuttal within that 15 seconds. So, and vice versa is true. So.
All right, Dan and Bryan, I just want to show you guys when we go like this, that means now.
Now.
Not slow down.
Yep, that means stop. All right, so the first question, can y'all use smaller words that we can understand?
Sorry, I've never seen you make a speechless.
Well, I will say that this is a university, right? Amen just means so be it. It's a university, and you can look them up in your phone, I suppose.
Okay, so we have some questions that will be directed at an individual, and then we have some questions that will be for both of you. So there's going to be a total of 5 questions for each of you, and then we have a couple of questions at the end that we would like both of you to answer, and we'll give both of you time to answer those. So our first question is going to be for Bryan. Bryan, if there is only one true God, how do you explain spiritual witnesses from religions all around the world, each with their own God?
That's a great question. The first answer is that we analyze based upon evidence, based upon narrative structure, based upon the worldview that the various gods are saying. There certainly are. Dan put up a list. There's a host of gods. The fact that there's a host of gods isn't somehow an argument that one of them isn't true. It certainly doesn't logically follow at all. And what we do is we would evaluate the claims corresponding to reality based upon what we find and what those claims are in that way. And I'm convinced that the God of the Bible gives the most coherent sense of ultimate reality.
I would just say that they can't all be true, but they can all be false.
Can we please go back to your question time? Dan, this is for you. Given our incomplete, fallible perception of the world, aren't all human observations, thoughts, even scientific ones, necessarily taken on faith to be true?
Well, as Bryan alluded to earlier, there are different usages of the same word, and the word faith is one of those words that can fall prey to equivocation. So, religious faith is different from what you might call, even atheists have faith in things. I have faith in the character of my dad. I might be wrong. I'm not pretending that my faith equals knowledge. Faith might be a provisional acceptance. And I think in science never goes to 100%. Science usually works with a probability that's, when it gets to what, 96, 97%, we round it off and say, okay, we're going to go with that. So I don't know if faith is the right word because it seems laden with religious ideas behind it. But yeah, I think all truth basically is probabilistic to some degree or another.
In in large part, I actually agree with Dan, but I would point out that Dan just acknowledged that he equivocated earlier than when he made a statement about faith.
Okay, Bryan, if we somehow exist outside of the brain, then why does damage to specific known regions change our personality, memory, behavior, priorities, and identities?
Great question, love it. It's because we are embodied souls. In fact, biblical theology teaches that we'll always be embodied souls, which means that there's an interface between soul and body that is complex, but necessary for what it means for us to be human. And as we interface, I can't weigh or measure in that sense a structural component of the soul. But what I can do is look at the soul and see that it relates in distinct ways to my body, collective, and my brain in particular. And so it would be natural that certain fibers would fire when I feel pain. It'd be natural that those C fibers would go. It'd be natural that I would look at my wife, who I love very much, and that certain things would go off. And I would anticipate and expect that different regions would respond differently and therefore be limited differently.
I think the word soul, at least with the lowercase s, is not a thing. It's just a synonym for personality or overall character or whatever. And it dies when the brain dies. It's gone when the brain is gone. And just like digestion dies when the stomach dies, the soul, whatever you want to call it, is gone. It depends on the functioning of his brain.
Dan, what are your thoughts on how the church fathers, Origen, Nyssa, read the Bible? Is not your reading of Christianity a 19th century fundamentalist one?
No, my reading is the 21st century. I read the scholars, I read people, I read the languages, and if the Bible can only be understood by scholars and experts who tell us what it really means, then God is inept. He did a poor job of communicating his message to the whole of humanity. If we need Bryan to explain it to us, if I can't just open it and read it and get it for myself, then God did a really bad job of communicating his so-called good word to the world.
Opening and reading the Bible was the ground of the Protestant Reformation. People followed that. Subsequently, had robust religious faith following that. And I do actually find not a 19th century response on Dan's part, but I actually do find a mid to late 20th century response. I actually think it's from the era that Dan ministered in, largely in that Pentecostal fundamentalist corridor.
Bryan, do you believe that an eternal hell is justifiable punishment for a finite sin?
Yes, I do, because we didn't recognize this in the judicial system itself in a very qualified way, I'll grant you. But by analogy, there are an act itself perpetrated against one person versus another does not necessarily mean that it will find its way to the same judicial proceeding, same result, same punitive judgment, because an offense against a particular person, a particular stature, what have you. And so therefore, I don't think that a sin against the ultimate being who created and sustained the breath of the being who sins is necessarily, should be lumped in a way that I punch Dan, therefore Dan punishes me in eternal hell. That sounds great with rhetoric, but it doesn't fly very well with logic.
The answer to Bryan's previous question, by the way, was ad hominem. Hell is grotesque. Hell is a holocaust. If there is a God and he did create a hell, and if I do meet him someday, then I would tell him to go to hell. He's the immoral one. He's the one who did the harm. He's the one who's threatening eternal violence because we didn't kiss his feet enough.
Dan, if God does not exist, how do we explain his existence in human thought throughout all of human history?
Yeah, well, if leprechauns don't exist, if spirits and devils and ghosts don't exist, how do we explain it? There's actually evidence for leprechauns. Have you ever eaten a box of Lucky Charms? There's a picture, there's story, there's songs. Human culture creates these things, and this God is not the same God in all these cultures. It's different gods, and they fight with each other. So I wouldn't use that as a generalized argument for the existence of God. And by the way, that doesn't mean it's true. Sexism is universal. Racism is universal. It doesn't mean these are things we should not fight against.
Sex is universal.
Sexism.
No, I'm answering the question. Sex is universal. Race is universal. The perversion of those things may not be universal in that way. I think what you're missing is that there is, I think, very much a natural creative bent for us to have religious-oriented background beliefs by the very nature of our physical creation. That coheres very well with the idea that we would be ready for God.
Bryan, women are often seen as beneath men and often do not play as large of roles in Christianity. Why would God create women but not treat them equally?
First, he did create them equally. They're both created in the image of God, Genesis 1:28-30. Secondly, as a father of 3 girls with a wife, a female dog, and my mother living at home, I'm an expert in women. I'm an expert in women. And so they are created equally, and women are afforded tremendous opportunity. In fact, the movement of women's rights comes out of a Judeo-Christian background. And if you want to talk about, I'll leave it at that.
No, it does not come out of Judeo-Christian background. My wife has extensively researched women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a proud atheist for her whole life, and Susan B. Anthony, a proud agnostic. But in the Bible, women are devalued. Women are property. Look at the 10th commandment. You shall not covet your husband, your neighbor's slave, ox, cattle, slaves, or wives. Women are cheapened within the biblical tradition.
Dan, if you don't like or agree with God's way of doing things, how is that an argument against his existence? If God does exist, doesn't he make the rules?
Well, 2 answers. Bryan raised the moral argument tonight that theism is a basis for morality, and so that makes criticism of the fictional God of the Bible a valid argument on the table. But it'd be like saying, I think the big bad wolf is really a bad character. Even though he doesn't exist, I can still exercise my moral judgment to denounce that character if it did exist. It's a good thing that God doesn't exist, or this would be a horrible universe we live in.
I think it would be odd if the big bad wolf didn't exist for me to travel around the world in lecture halls telling everybody that the big bad wolf didn't exist. I think you're doing that because of the implications and the weight of what theistic existence brings to the table, which is weighty and true and very, very serious.
Bryan, final question. Religion is often dictated by a given sect's view on morality. What is your take on absolute moral truth? Are all people under a universal moral law?
Yes, because we have a universal moral lawgiver first. We have what John Calvin called a sensus divinitatis, a kind of dispositional awareness, not necessarily a fully conscious, but at least a subconscious category, that there is something ultimate. We have a framework known as common grace that moves within us, and we all recognize that torturing 3-year-old children for fun is wrong, and if your sect says it is, it doesn't mean that it's now culturally conditioned or socially constructed to be right. It is universally wrong in that regard. We also have natural law that functions, and the only way we can actually get any kind of an ought is from the is of God. You can't get it from the changing is of naturalistic, mindless, purposeless existence.
The God of the Bible ordered the Israelites to torture innocent 3-year-old children, to kill them, to stab them, to kill them and their families and their mothers and their fathers. He ordered that. He ordered the rape of women, by the way, in Jeremiah 13. There's no such thing as a universal moral law, but there are universal moral principles that we find within the natural world.
Dan, final question. Is it, in fact, arrogant and anthropocentric to presume that science can explain everything there is to know?
Science doesn't claim that. In fact, Bryan misrepresented my position on science. Science is a way of observing the world and working with hypotheses. I don't think any scientist says we're going to know everything there is to possibly know. But science does know some things, and it is through the progress of science that we have discarded previously false beliefs, like many of the beliefs that are in the Bible.
Dan is a naturalist. I read it. You're a naturalist.
Proudly.
Yeah. Dan is a naturalist. A naturalist is exactly the definition I gave you from Mercator's Dictionary of Philosophy, and it claims to explain everything.
Okay, the next couple of questions will be for both of you. The first one, we will have Bryan answer first. You'll have 1 minute, and then we'll give Dan 1 minute to answer.
So we get 1 minute each?
Yes.
Ooh, it's a luxury.
Okay, would any amount of evidence change either of your beliefs? If so, how much evidence would that take?
Okay. Yes, there are evidences that would change my beliefs, because I'm not just a theist in the abstract. I'm a pastor, for crying out loud. I'm a committed, Bible-believing Christian. I'm not a literalist. I'm a literarialist. We could say it that way. But if you could prove to me that the resurrection of Christ never happened, and you could close that door completely, then I would at very least have to, I think, logically give up Christianity, because the resurrection is core to the nature of Christianity itself. That doesn't necessarily mean I would give up on the idea of God in the abstract, because frankly, I think there's a lot of reasons outside of the resurrection and outside of the historical claims of Christ, and outside even of the biblical data, just in terms of natural logic, law, and so forth, to make the case for a supremely, ultimately existing metaphysical being.
Well, I was a pastor too. I preached for 19 years, evangelist, missionary. And I used to preach what Paul said, without the resurrection of Jesus, our faith is in vain. I now know that the resurrection of Christ has been not disproved, but it has been discounted so much that it is very, very unlikely that we would say that he rose from the dead. There's so much scholarship going on. I think the resurrection of Jesus is the worst possible example you could give to prove the Bible, because it's given so many times. All of the accounts contradict each other. Biblical scholars, conservative scholars even agree that you cannot take those contradictory accounts and make them into one coherent whole. I have a thing called the Easter Challenge, where I challenge you or anyone else to go through those 5 at least versions of the resurrection stories and try to just tell the story. There are better explanations. Legendary growth shows that as the century passed, it started out simple, it grew bigger and bigger and bigger. It shows all the footprints of legend making and myth making, and very little evidence of actual real history. The resurrection of Jesus did not happen. So you want to join our group?
No.
All right, this last question is for both of you. This is more maybe of a practical question, and then you will have your 5-minute closing
Who goes
statements.
first?
Dan will go first. Dan and Bryan. Dan, why do 2 people looking at the same evidence come to different conclusions?
I think it's fear. I think Bryan is afraid of something. He's afraid of not having eternal life. He's afraid of death. I think Bryan is afraid of the judgment of this angry God. And he says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I think it's a fear-based morality that Christians have. He's a wrathful God. He built a torture chamber. He built a hell where you're going to suffer, you're going to hurt if you don't worship and adore his holiness. So I think it's basically an attitude of needing a father figure, an alpha male, a commanding officer, a slave master above you to tell you what to do, how to live your life. Because if you don't have that father figure, you're afraid of stepping out of line and you're going to be punished. I think that's really what's at the core of Christian belief. Whereas most of us atheists and agnostics, we discard that. We don't live with that fear. We live with real hope, with real love, and real morality.
Yeah, I think it's presuppositions and background beliefs. We have different presuppositions and background beliefs that are driven by a number of concerns. I do think that it's existential at its core. In that, I think that it's who gets to say, I think, is the ultimate question. I would flip it back on Dan. I think Dan is scared to death. And I think he's scared to death of not being in complete control of himself. And so he is in love with self-autonomy. And I think that love for self-autonomy ends up driving both self-awareness, it drives moral structure, it drives just overall valuation of a host of things. And that point about sort of the fear and father and so forth, Paul Vitz put that to bed in a book called The Faith of the Fatherless, where he actually, Freud had no actual clinical analysis, don't you know that now? We had no clinical analysis for the Freudian theory, projection theory. But Vitz did. And Vitz analyzed the fathers of atheism and Faith of the Fatherless. Great book, you should read it.
All right. So now we will have our 5-minute closing statements. And since Bryan got to open, Dan is going to get to close. And so, Bryan.
Okay. Thanks, Dan, for engaging these ideas. One of the things that I hope you've seen is, I don't think Dan provided any answers in regard to naturalism. He said, yeah, there are a lot of questions out there. That's part of my point. My point was that there are a lot of questions, but I think theism can't answer them. Can it answer them to a certainty? Probably not. Does it infer the best explanation? And that's the threshold of what constitutes reasonable belief. Whether you're an atheist here, and you're an atheistic naturalist, or whether you are a committed theist, you're inferring to the best explanation, because there are things that you don't know. But the argument regarding consciousness points to something. It points to an adequate basis for it, and atheism provides that. Free will points to something that's not determined, that's not reductionistic. It points to an adequate basis. Morality points to something. What Dan does repeatedly, and what he's not alone, this is the kind of the plight of the new atheists. In fact, he talked about theists kind of getting their act together and stuff like this. Atheism is frayed all over the place. If you doubt this, read John Gray's latest book, The 7 Types of Atheism, came out in October of last year. And Gray points this out, the frame. He's an atheist, he's a committed atheist. But he really doesn't care for the new atheists, because he feels like they don't seem to have the internal stuff, what the great theologian Rocky Balboa said, the stuff in the basement, to be able to happen to the dark and stark reality of what naturalism actually says the world is. So they have a set of illusions. Dan subscribes to a number of these. There's an illusion of self-identity, actually, that there's actually a real me that's happening. Well, there's not really, but you're better off living in that illusion. Dan says in his own writings, as admitted, freedom is an illusion. Design, Richard Dawkins says, is an illusion. Purpose of life, or purpose in life, it becomes its own illusion. Meaning is an illusion. Moral judgment is an illusion. Altruism is an illusion. Justice, there's no rooting for justice. The cry that his whole argument has hinged upon would be illusory by his own naturalistic lights. He said in his own writings, moral judgment is actually meaningless. So it's difficult for me to understand how we can actually take seriously a worldview that's still living in the basement of the Judeo-Christian faith and still writing its checks out of our bank account. That's stark to me. Well, our time's been limited tonight. I do hope you've seen that atheistic naturalism fails to account for some of the most substantive matters of human existence. And we could have gone on to list a number more than what we've listed: immaterial laws, laws of logic, mathematics, beauty, miracles, near-death experiences. I've mentioned some of these other things already. Specified complexity, cosmic order, among other facets of our universe. But a story that cannot account for life and living as it really is lacks the warrant for its acceptance as a viable world view. In contrast, theism grounds, governs, justifies each of the facets, providing a viable worldview with explanatory power. And with a minute and a half left, I want to conclude with this. I think it's important to note that a worldview has to be livable. Now, if you have to step out and say it's only livable if you believe in illusions, I don't think you've actually grounded the livability of your worldview. And I think you have to actually reconsider that pretty seriously, that it doesn't have the categories for that. I think in light of that, you have to then think about livability in general. And I would submit to you, not in the abstract about God, but as a preacher, I would submit to you that I think there's a narrative of Christ who takes on all the suffering of humanity. And in taking on all the suffering of humanity, and in taking on all of the failure, mistakes, sins of humanity upon himself, I think there's something to be had at the heart of the Christian faith. That the heart of the Christian faith is that God would so envelop and invest himself in the human plight to make sense of an admittedly chaotic narrative, to bring resolution to it, so that you could live, and not just live for now, but you could actually live for eternity in that wise. But I actually think the theistic worldview just makes a lot more sense, and I don't think it's rocket science. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian, and thank all of you. It doesn't make any difference. We atheists have livable lives. You live your life pretty much on a day-to-day level like a practical atheist. You do the same things I do. We love our families. We have to mow the lawn, change the diapers, and pay the rent. We all have to get through our natural lives as biological organisms in a natural world. And so you have some idea in your head about some cosmic purpose. Fine. It's a free country. Many of us don't have that idea in our head. And our lives are immensely livable and meaningful and purposeful and hopeful. And who is anyone to tell us that it's not? It's a bit of preachiness, I think, to suggest otherwise. You misquoted me. I did not say moral judgment is meaningless. I said moral judgment is ultimately meaningless, but that it is immediately meaningful in our lives as we live now. So ultimately, there is no purpose of life. That's good news, actually. We wouldn't want there to be a purpose of life, because that would make us slaves or subservient to something. But if you take it from top down to bottom up, there's immense purpose in life, which comes from solving problems as biological organisms in a natural world, which we both agree exists. And I think pretty much our morality is almost pretty much the same in our day-to-day lives. Yeah, you mentioned the resurrection. You should have brought that up right at the beginning. If you're going to give evidence, why didn't you just start with the resurrection? There's actually something we can sink our teeth into. All this other stuff, all these words, how many of you initially came to your faith in God, those of you who believe, as a result of contemplating Aristotelian metaphysics? Any of you? This is just a lot of hand-waving and a lot of words that don't connect any dots. So you can say all these things, you can talk about design, you can talk about cosmology, you can talk about moral arguments, but how do you connect the dots between those questions and your actual creature, this being, this thing with a brain that functions, that has desires and fears and all that? How do you connect, how do you convince us that that thing up there that's imagined in your brain, that it actually really exists, other than it's the explanation, the best explanation? Actually, I have shown that the consciousness argument is a bad argument. We do have strong natural explanations for the origin of consciousness and how it works as a feedback loop. Most organisms are aware, but when you can become aware of yourself being aware, I doubt that a chipmunk ever asks, why did I think that? I mean, they're natural organisms, but we have a big enough brain where we can start making a feedback loop. Oh, I'm thinking about myself thinking, and I'm thinking about you thinking. That creates this emergent realm, illusion, I guess is a good word for it, that there's actually something there that isn't really there. It's a function. So there is a good natural explanation for consciousness, and there's a lot of good books that do explain consciousness. Suppose you were in prison. Suppose you were convicted of a horrible crime, and you're serving some time in prison. And then you got the very good news that you're being released today, immediately. You're set free. How do you feel about that? Pretty good, right? Wow, I'm free. What would make you feel better? Learning that the reason you were set free was because of the good graces of the governor who pardoned you, or the reason you were set free was because you were found to be innocent of the crime in the first place? Which would you prefer to be the answer? Christians glorify this God because he has set them free. They're guilty of sin. They are bad. They're corrupt. They're degenerate human beings according to the Bible. Your own self-image as a human being is that you are bad, deserving of eternal torment. You have this self-image imposed on you by this book. Most of us non-believers don't have that. We are innocent of the crime. We don't feel these angst and these things that you're trying to project upon us, Freudian-wise or otherwise. So, I think I've shown that there is at least reasonable doubt. I'm the defense attorney. There's at least reasonable doubt that a God exists. There's no good evidence. I wish we had talked about the resurrection, because I could show you very clearly what's wrong with the resurrection. I can. I've done a lot of debates on it. Maybe you've read some of them. There's no really coherent definition of this God, and I don't think we heard one. I think what Bryan is trying to say is, look at all these questions we have, therefore God exists. There's no agreement among believers, and the agreements among atheists don't point to anything, because we're not making a claim. You are the ones making the claim. We're simply saying, hey, prove your case or not. Or there's basically no need for a God. And of course, according to the Bible, if the Bible is your source of truth, it is a bad evidence for morality and for the existence of God. So thank you very much. This has been a fun time. I'm glad you came, and we'll continue the debate another time, maybe. Thank you, Bryan.
All right, well, good job. Very good job. And it's been a great night. We've been able to discuss these things without any physical activity or anything like that. Hey, and Brock, where's Brock at? Right there. Good job. You put a lot into this event, so let's give Brock a And both Bryan and Dave will be up there.
Dan.
I'm sorry. Dan will be up there, and they'll be selling books. They might even write something in it if you want them to do that. I don't know if I'm saying, is that good, sir? All right. And so, thank you everybody for coming. All right, have a great night.